Bubble Witch Podcast, Episode 7, Lammas Week 2, Gathering Tiny Joys. Welcome back, friends. I'm glad you're here. Wherever you've found yourself today, I hope you've settled into a comfortable little corner for a while. Maybe you're working on a craft. Maybe you're driving home from work. Maybe you're folding laundry. Or maybe you've finally managed to sit down with a warm cup of tea before the rest of the world remembers you exist. However you arrived, welcome. Last week, we stepped into Lammas together. We talked about arriving at the harvest, not harvesting, not preserving, not trying to accomplish everything all at once, simply arriving. We practiced noticing that the season had already been quietly feeding us. This week, I'd like to stay there a little longer because I've been thinking about something. We spend so much of our lives waiting for the big moments, the vacation, the birthday, the promotion, the holiday, the finish line. But when I look back over my own life, those aren't usually the memories that stay with me. It's the little things, the smell of fresh bread, the first sip of tea after a long day, watching sunlight come through the sewing room window, a family story that still makes everyone laugh years later. I think Lammas understands something we've forgotten. Little things aren't little. They're what life is mostly made of. This past weekend was one of the busiest weekends I've had all summer. 5 events in 2 days. Face painting, balloon twisting, bubbles, carnival games, building parade floats. If you'd looked at my calendar, you probably would have guessed I'd be too busy to notice much of anything. And honestly, there were moments when I wasn't entirely convinced I'd remember my own name by Sunday afternoon. But funny enough, that's not what I remember. I remember my grandkids helping. Not because anyone asked them to, because they wanted to. I remember a little boy proudly carrying balloons that were almost bigger than he was. I remember a little girl standing completely still while bubbles floated over her head like she had just discovered magic. I remember laughing with my family while we were all exhausted. Those are the moments that stayed. Not the numbers, not the workload, the moments. Maybe that's harvest too. Not gathering wheat, gathering memories. Of course, no Bubble Witch Week would be complete without at least a little chaos. So let me tell you about Magic. Magic is one of our kittens. He's sweet, he's fearless, and he has all the confidence of someone who's never had to deal with the consequences of his own decisions. I just finished making 5 gallons of bubble solution for the parade. Now, if you've never made 5 gallons of bubble solution, that's not something you throw together in 30 seconds. There's measuring, mixing, waiting, stirring, trying very hard not to splash it all over yourself. When I finally finished, I remember looking at that bucket and thinking, well, one thing is actually ready, which, during parade week, felt like quite an accomplishment. Then, magic happened. He spotted his mama across the room. He crouched down. His little back end started wiggling. You know, the look. That look kittens get when they've already committed to an idea and absolutely no further thinking is going to happen. Well, he launched himself into the air with complete confidence, missed his mama entirely, and landed squarely in the middle of my 5-gallon bucket of bubble solution. Splash. Now, it's surprisingly difficult to rescue a bubble-covered kitten while you're laughing. He looked absolutely offended, as though somehow this entire situation had happened to him while he was just sitting there minding his own business. He got a warm rinse, a fluffy towel, lots of cuddles, and after all that excitement, he climbed into my lap, fell asleep, and somehow made me feel guilty for interrupting his adventure. I've laughed about that all weekend, not because it was convenient. It certainly wasn't. But because now it's one of those family stories. Years from now, somebody will say, "Remember when Magic jumped into the bubble bucket?" And we'll all laugh all over again. Sometimes the stories that feed our hearts begin with complete chaos. One of my favorite pages in this week's chapter is called "Things That Are Quietly Feeding Me." When I wrote that page, I thought I understood it. Then this weekend happened, and I was reminded that nourishment doesn't have to be something big. Most of the time, it is actually the little things. Seeing my husband shake his head and smile while he is watching me apologize and soothe my kitten after his impromptu bubble bath. Watching my grandkids laugh together, sitting quietly in my sewing room. A sleepy kitten, a favorite mug, music playing while I worked, the sound of my sewing machine humming. Tiny comforts, ordinary comforts, the kinds of things we often stop noticing because they're there every day. One of my favorite lines from this week's chapter says, "Humans are not machines. Tiny comforts are not frivolous. They are maintenance." I think that's something many of us need to hear. We live in a world that celebrates hustle, more, faster, bigger, always chasing the next thing. Nature doesn't seem to be in nearly that much of a hurry. The wheat grows, the berries ripen, the bees keep visiting flowers. Nobody seems terribly concerned about productivity reports. Nature simply continues doing what it was created to do. Maybe we could learn something from that. One of the sections in this week's book is called Low Energy Lammas. I smiled while writing it, because not every week leaves us overflowing with energy. Sometimes life is simply a lot. Maybe this week you bake homemade bread. Wonderful. Maybe you make the heart candles from this week's craft. I hope you enjoy every minute. Or maybe all you have energy for is making a cup of tea and sitting quietly for 10 minutes. That counts too. Congratulations! You participated in Lammas. There are no seasonal report cards here. Now, I should probably confess something. Everybody talks about sitting outside listening to the crickets. You all go right ahead. Crickets creep me out. I don't know why. They just do. So, if you're imagining me peacefully sitting on the porch listening to the evening chorus, what you're actually picturing is me occasionally looking over my shoulder thinking, I know one of you little weirdos is planning something. And I think that's okay. Seasonal living doesn't mean you have to love every single thing nature throws at you. I adore raccoons, crickets, and I have agreed to maintain a respectful distance from one another. We don't all find wonder in the same places. Maybe yours is birdsong, maybe butterflies, maybe rain on the roof, maybe the smell of fresh-cut hay. The point isn't noticing what everyone else notices. The point is noticing what speaks to you. This week's recipe invites us to slow down, not because the food itself is magical, because making something with our hands reminds us to be present, to sit down, to share it if we'd like, or not. Sometimes making yourself something comforting is reason enough. The same goes for this week's craft. Heart candles aren't really about candles. They're about creating little reminders to pause. Little reminders that quietly say, it's okay, sit down for a minute, the world will still be there. There's also an activity this week called Building a Comfort Basket. I love this idea. Imagine gathering together the little things that help you on difficult days. Tea, a favorite book, soft socks, chocolate, a candle, a journal, a tiny bottle of bubbles. Whatever reminds you that comfort isn't something you have to earn. Sometimes loving your future self looks like leaving little gifts for the days when life feels heavy. One of the journal prompts this week asks, "What comforts have quietly carried me through difficult seasons?" I think that's a beautiful question. My list would include my husband, my sewing room, books, watching children laugh, my family, bubbles, and apparently, bubble-soaked kittens. What would be on yours? Maybe spend a few minutes making that list. Not because someone assigned homework, because sometimes we forget just how many good things have quietly carried us. You know, I've been thinking about something today as I record this episode. A few weeks ago, I spent 5 hours blowing bubbles in the rain at Fairy Fest. Most people would have said the weather ruined the event. I never really saw it that way. The kids were still laughing. The bubbles were still floating. Actually, rain bubbles are kind of beautiful. Then, this weekend, our 4th of July fireworks started. Not long after, the rain came. Not a sprinkle. A real Oklahoma summer storm. People climbed into their cars, rolled their windows down just enough to watch the fireworks. The show kept going. And I grabbed an armful of light-up freedom balloons and started walking from car to car, in the rain, twisting balloons, handing them through open windows, watching little faces light up brighter than the balloons themselves. Nobody seemed to care that we were getting wet. At some point, I realized I didn't either. Then it hit me. A few weeks ago, I was making bubbles in the rain. Now I was making balloons in the rain. Apparently, this is becoming a theme. Good thing I'm a water baby. But maybe it's more than that. Maybe I've been learning something without realizing it. I spend a lot of time talking about finding joy, finding tiny moments of magic, finding comfort in ordinary things. I think sometimes we assume those things need good weather. Turns out, they don't. Joy doesn't seem to care if it's sunny. It doesn't mind muddy shoes, or wet hair, or a soaking, wet kitten who accidentally took a bubble bath. Joy is remarkably adaptable. It simply asks us to show up. Sometimes with sunshine, sometimes with storms. Either way, there are still children laughing, there are still bubbles floating, there are still balloons glowing, there are still stories we'll be telling years from now. And that's what tiny joys really are. Not perfect moments, moments we choose to keep. And I think that's a much kinder way to move through the world. Now, let's open this week's Tiny Season Companion and pull a card. This week's invitation is a gratitude card. Notice one tiny comfort you've stopped noticing. Maybe it's always been there. Maybe today, you simply saw it again. If you're following along in the Bubble Witch's Little Book of Lammas, I hope this week's chapter reminds you that abundance isn't always measured in bushels. Sometimes abundance is a warm mug between your hands, a family story you'll laugh about for years, a rainy evening, a glowing balloon, a bubble floating through a storm, the people who show up beside you, the little things that quietly keep your heart full. Whether you have the book beside you or you're simply joining me here every week, thank you. Thank you for sharing another little piece of the season with me. And before anyone worries, I promise no kittens were harmed in the making of bubble juice. One was mildly offended, then promptly cuddled, dried off, and spoiled rotten. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself, make a little magic, embrace a little mischief, accept the occasional chaos, and remember, sometimes the smallest joys become the richest harvest. I'll meet you again, somewhere between the bubbles and the tea.